There is a photograph from December 1977. President Jimmy Carter is standing in Tehran, raising a glass of champagne at a state dinner hosted by the Shah of Iran. Carter called Iran, and I want to quote this precisely, an island of stability in one of the more troubled areas of the world. Less than 2 years later, that island was gone. The Shah had fled. A revolution had taken his place. And 52 American diplomats would spend the next 444 days as hostages in the city where that dinner was held. Welcome to the Policy Room. I'm Daniel Carter, and today we are asking one of the most consequential questions in modern geopolitics. Why are the United States and Iran rivals?
Thank you, Daniel. And I think that photograph is actually the perfect place to start because it captures something important. When we talk about the US-Iran rivalry today, people often assume it has always existed, that these two countries were always on opposite sides. But the history is far more complicated than that, and far more instructive. There was a real relationship here. There was alignment, cooperation, and genuine strategic partnership. And understanding how that relationship collapsed, and why it has never recovered, is really the only way to make sense of what we see happening between Washington and Tehran today.
That is exactly the framing I want to explore with you over the course of this conversation. And before we go anywhere, I want to introduce our guest properly, because her background is directly relevant to why this conversation is going to be different from what you might hear elsewhere. Dr. Sara Kashani is a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution's Middle East Policy Program here in Washington. She served as a consultant to the State Department on Iran affairs for 6 years. She is Iranian-American. She has studied this relationship from both sides of it, and she has written what I consider one of the most clear-eyed books on this subject available today.
Thank you. And I'll just add, because I think it matters for this conversation, that I approach this topic without a political agenda in either direction. I have family in Iran. I have colleagues in Washington who have spent careers trying to manage this rivalry. I have seen the human cost of this conflict on both sides. So my goal today is not to assign blame. It is to explain. Because I genuinely believe that most people, whether they are American, Iranian, or neither, deserve a clear, honest account of how we got here.
And that is precisely what we are going to build together today. We are going to move through roughly 70 years of history, from a CIA-backed coup in 1953 that most Americans have never heard of, through a revolution, a hostage crisis, proxy wars, a nuclear standoff, the collapse of a historic diplomatic agreement, and the dangerous present moment we are living in right now. For our viewers who are also using this episode to strengthen their English, welcome. The word at the center of today's conversation is rivals. Not enemies in the sense of nations at war, but adversaries who compete for influence, for regional power, and for recognition, and who have shaped each other's decisions for decades without ever fully resolving the tension between them.
That distinction between rivals and enemies is one I will come back to several times today, because I think it is more than just a vocabulary question. It actually changes how you think about whether resolution is possible. Enemies, in the true sense, seek each other's destruction. Rivals compete within a shared world. The United States and Iran are, at their most rational, rivals. The tragedy is that they have often chosen to behave like enemies, and that choice has been enormously costly for both countries and for the wider region.
So let us begin at the beginning. Not in 1979, not with the hostage crisis, not with the nuclear program, but with a moment in 1953 that most Americans do not know happened, and that Iranians have never forgotten. Sarah, can you take us there? Daniel Carter. Before we go to 1953, Sarah, I want to make sure everyone watching has a clear picture of where Iran actually sits in the world. Because I think one of the reasons this rivalry is so hard to understand is that people underestimate how strategically important Iran is, not just to the United States, but to the entire global system. So let's start with something basic. If you were explaining Iran's geography to someone who had never looked at a map of the Middle East, how would you describe it?
I would say, imagine a country sitting at the center of a chessboard. To its west, you have Iraq and Turkey. To its east, Afghanistan and Pakistan. To the north, the Caspian Sea and the former Soviet republics. And to the south, the Persian Gulf and the Arabian Sea. Iran does not sit on the edge of anything. It sits in the middle of everything. Three of the world's most strategically sensitive zones, the Middle East, Central Asia, and South Asia, all converge around Iranian territory. That geographic position alone explains why no major power, including the United States, has ever been able to simply ignore what happens there.
And then there is the water. Because when I think about Iran's strategic importance, the Strait of Hormuz is the detail that always stops me. Can you explain to our viewers what that strait is and why it matters so much?
The Strait of Hormuz is a narrow waterway, at its narrowest point, roughly 33 kilometers wide, that connects the Persian Gulf to the open ocean. Approximately 20% of all the oil traded globally passes through that strait. Every tanker carrying oil from Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Kuwait, and Iraq has to move through that choke point. Iran controls one shoreline. The United States' Fifth Fleet is based just across the Gulf in Bahrain. So you have the world's most important energy corridor, with the two most significant rivals in the region sitting on opposite sides of it. The strategic tension is not abstract. It is literally written into the geography.
20% of global oil through a waterway that is 33 kilometers wide at its narrowest. That is a remarkable number, and it means that any serious escalation between the U.S. and Iran is not just a bilateral problem. It immediately becomes a global economic problem.
Exactly. And that is a form of leverage that Iran understands very well. Even without a nuclear weapon, even under severe sanctions, Iran retains the ability to threaten one of the arteries of the global economy. That is not a small card to hold. It is one of the reasons why every U.S. administration, regardless of party, regardless of ideology, has had to develop a serious Iran policy. You cannot manage global energy security without managing your relationship with Tehran.
Let's talk about the country itself, its people, its size, its identity. Because I think there is another common misconception that I want to address directly. A lot of people in the U.S. think of Iran as an Arab country. That is not correct, is it?
It is not correct, and the distinction matters enormously, both politically and culturally. Iranians are Persian, not Arab. They speak Farsi, not Arabic. Iran is home to one of the oldest continuous civilizations on Earth, a civilization that predates Islam by more than 1,000 years. When Iranians talk about their national identity, they are drawing on 2,500 years of Persian history, literature, philosophy, and empire. That sense of historical depth and cultural pride is not background detail. It is a live force in Iranian politics today. The concept of national dignity, in Farsi, the word is abaru, is central to how Iranian leaders and ordinary citizens both think about their place in the world.
And in terms of scale, Iran is not a small country. We are talking about 85 million people, one of the largest populations in the entire Middle East.
That is right. And it is a young, highly educated population. Iran has one of the highest rates of university enrollment in the region. Its engineers, scientists, and medical professionals are among the best trained in the world. Many of them, of course, now living in the United States and Europe, which is itself a story worth telling. The country's human capital is enormous. And that creates a permanent tension that sits at the heart of the rivalry. Because the Iranian people, broadly speaking, are not hostile to the outside world. Many are genuinely curious about it. The hostility is largely a product of governance, not culture.
That is a distinction I want to make sure we hold on to throughout this conversation. The difference between the Iranian state and the Iranian people. Because they are not the same thing, and conflating them leads to some very bad analysis.
It leads to very bad policy as well. And it is a mistake that has been made repeatedly in Washington. When you design a sanctions regime, for example, and you assume that economic pressure on the population will translate into political pressure on the government, you are assuming that The population and the government share the same interests. In Iran's case, they often do not. Sanctions hurt ordinary Iranians. They rarely dislodge revolutionary governments. That gap between the people and the state is one of the most important things to understand about this rivalry.
And then there is the resource dimension. Because Iran is not just strategically located and demographically significant, it is also extraordinarily wealthy in natural resources.
Iran holds the world's second-largest natural gas reserves and the fourth-largest proven oil reserves. For most of the 20th century, that wealth made Iran a prize, something to be controlled, influenced, and extracted from, in the view of outside powers. Britain was doing exactly that for decades before 1953. And the memory of that extraction, of a foreign power taking Iranian resources while Iranians remained poor, is not something that faded with time. It became foundational to Iranian political identity. It is the direct reason why, when a prime minister named Mohammad Mossadegh stood up in 1951 and said this oil belongs to Iran, the entire country erupted in support of him.
And that moment, 1951, the nationalization of Iranian oil, and then what followed in 1953, is exactly where we are going next. Because you cannot understand the U.S.-Iran rivalry without understanding what the United States did in that year and why Iranians have never stopped. Sara, we have established that Iran is a country of enormous strategic weight, geographically, demographically, and in terms of natural resources. Now, I want to go to the moment that, in your view and in the view of most serious scholars of this relationship, is the true starting point of the rivalry. Not 1979, not the hostage crisis, but 1953. Before we get into what happened, tell us who Mohammad Mossadegh was. Because I think most of our viewers, especially our American viewers, will not know that name.
Mossadegh was, in many ways, one of the most remarkable political figures of the 20th century, and one of the least known outside of Iran. He was Iran's democratically elected prime minister, serving from 1951 to 1953. He was educated in Europe, deeply committed to constitutional governance, and genuinely popular in a way that was rare for that era in the Middle East. Time magazine named him Person of the Year in 1951. He was known for his emotional directness. He would weep in parliament, which was unusual for a statesman of that period, but underneath that emotional style was a very sharp political mind and a very clear mission.
And what was that mission?
It was straightforward. Iran's oil was being extracted by the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, which is today known as BP. Britain had held a concession on Iranian oil since 1913. The terms were deeply unfavorable to Iran. Britain was taking the majority of the profits. Iranian workers at the oil facilities were paid very little and lived in conditions that were, by any standard, exploitative. Mossadegh looked at this arrangement and said, "This is Iranian oil, extracted from Iranian land, and it should benefit the Iranian people." In 1951, his government nationalized the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. The entire country celebrated. Britain was furious.
And Britain's response was not simply diplomatic, was it?
No. Britain initially tried economic pressure, organizing an international boycott of Iranian oil, which caused serious economic damage. But Mossadegh held firm. When Winston Churchill returned to power in Britain in 1951, the approach shifted. Churchill reframed the situation entirely. This was no longer a trade dispute. This was a communist threat. The argument presented to Washington was that Mossadegh's weakness and the economic chaos his government was facing due to the boycott was creating an opening for Soviet influence in Iran. If Moscow filled that vacuum, the entire Persian Gulf could fall into the Soviet orbit.
And the Eisenhower administration accepted that framing.
The Eisenhower administration accepted it almost immediately. President Eisenhower had just taken office. The Cold War was at one of its most anxious moments. The idea that a strategically vital, oil-rich country sitting on the Soviet Union's southern border might tilt toward Moscow was exactly the kind of scenario that drove American foreign policy decision-making in that era. The CIA, under Director Allen Dulles, and British intelligence, MI6, began planning a covert operation to remove Mossadegh from power.
Tell us what that operation looked like in practice.
The operation was called Ajax on the American side and Boot on the British side. It was, in essence, a manufactured crisis. CIA and MI6 operatives bribed Iranian military officers, paid agitators to create street violence, organized pro-Shah demonstrations, and worked to undermine Mossadegh's parliamentary support. In August 1953, the operation reached its conclusion. Iranian military units loyal to the Shah, organized and directed by Western intelligence, moved against Mossadegh's government. He was arrested at his home. The Shah, who had briefly fled to Rome when an earlier coup attempt failed, returned to Tehran and was restored to full power. Mossadegh was tried for treason and spent the rest of his life under house arrest. He died in 1967, never having been free again.
And the United States officially acknowledged its role in this coup, but it took 60 years to do so.
In 2013, the National Security Archive published declassified CIA documents that formally confirmed American involvement in the 1953 coup, 60 years after the fact. For many Iranians, that acknowledgement, while historically significant, arrived far too late to carry the emotional weight it might otherwise have had. The damage had already been done, not just to Mossadegh, but to Iranian democracy itself, because what 1953 ended was not just one government. It ended a genuine democratic experiment in a country that had been moving, imperfectly but genuinely, toward representative governance.
I want to ask you a question that I think gets to the heart of why this moment still matters. When you talk to Iranian scholars, Iranian policymakers, ordinary Iranian citizens, how present is 1953 in the conversation?
It is remarkably present. And I think the best way I can illustrate that for an American audience is this. Imagine that a foreign government had covertly organized the removal of a democratically elected American president, installed a compliant leader in his place, and then denied doing so for 60 years. How long do you think Americans would carry that memory? How much would it shape the way they thought about that foreign government's intentions? That is the weight that 1953 carries in Iran. It is not ancient history. It is the founding wound of the modern U.S.-Iran relationship.
And it is the lens through which almost everything that followed has been interpreted, by Iranian leaders and by ordinary Iranians.
Precisely. Every time the United States has imposed sanctions on Iran, supported Iran's adversaries, or demanded that Iran give up its strategic programs, the Iranian response, at every level of society, has been filtered through the memory of 1953. The question that never fully goes away is, what does America actually want from us? Is this diplomacy, or is this another version of what happened to Mossadegh? That question has made genuine trust between these two governments almost impossible to build and very easy to destroy.
A democratically elected government removed, a compliant Shah installed, and now Washington has a partner in Tehran for the next 26 years. But as we are about to see, that partnership was built on a foundation that was far more fragile than it appeared from the outside. So after 1953, the Shah is back on the throne, restored by a CIA operation. And Washington now has exactly what it wanted. A pro-Western leader, sitting on enormous oil reserves, positioned along the Soviet Union's southern border. From a Cold War strategic perspective, it looks like a clean win for the United States. Sara, what did that alliance actually look like during the 26 years that followed?
It looked from the outside like a model partnership. The Shah, Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi, was everything Washington wanted in a regional ally. He was secular, he was pro-Western in his cultural orientation. He was willing to sell oil to Israel when Arab states imposed embargoes, and he was deeply hostile to Soviet influence. Under the Nixon Doctrine, Iran was designated as one of the twin pillars of Gulf security, alongside Saudi Arabia, meaning Washington was essentially asking Tehran to police the region on America's behalf. The U.S. sold Iran enormous quantities of advanced military hardware. The relationship was close, it was lucrative, and it was, on the surface, stable.
And yet underneath that stability, something very different was happening.
Something very different was happening. And it was happening in plain sight if you were willing to look. The Shah's government operated one of the most feared internal security apparatuses in the world. SAVAK, the Iranian secret police, was created in 1957 with direct CIA and Israeli intelligence assistance. Its mandate was to identify, surveil, arrest and neutralize political opponents. In practice, that meant leftists, Islamists, intellectuals, labor organizers, student activists, anyone who challenged the Shah's authority. Thousands of Iranians were imprisoned. Many were tortured, some were executed, and ordinary Iranians knew this. They lived with it. The association between Savak and American support became one of the most corrosive elements of Iranian attitudes toward the United States.
So the United States was not just allied with the Shah. It was, in a meaningful sense, co-responsible for the repression his government carried out.
That is the conclusion that many Iranians drew, and I think it is difficult to argue against it seriously. When you train a secret police force, when you provide it with interrogation techniques, when you sell weapons to the government it protects, and when you publicly celebrate that government as a beacon of stability, you are not a passive bystander. You are a participant. And that participation left a mark that went far deeper than any official U.S. policy statement could ever erase.
At the same time, the Shah was genuinely trying to modernize Iran. The White Revolution in the 1960s, this was a real reform program, wasn't it?
It was real in the sense that it produced measurable changes. The White Revolution, launched in 1963, included land redistribution, the expansion of women's suffrage, the development of a literacy corps, and the rapid growth of secular education and infrastructure. Iran's cities were being transformed. Its middle class was growing. Women were entering universities and professional life in significant numbers. By the 1970s, Tehran was a cosmopolitan capital with a genuine cultural scene. If you were a member of the educated elite or part of the Shah's favored circles, Iran in the 1970s could feel like a country on the rise.
But the White Revolution also generated serious opposition, particularly from the religious establishment.
Particularly from a cleric named Ruhollah Khomeini, who began publicly attacking the Shah in the early 1960s. Khomeini's objections were partly theological. He argued that the reforms violated Islamic principles, but they were also deeply political. He saw the White Revolution as a westernization project imposed from above, without democratic consent, funded by oil revenues that were ultimately tied to foreign interests. When Khomeini spoke about the Shah's program, he framed it not as modernization but as cultural colonialism. That framing resonated with a very large segment of Iranian society that felt bypassed, disrespected, and alienated by the pace and direction of change.
And Khomeini was not simply marginalized, he was exiled.
He was arrested in 1963 after delivering a particularly powerful public sermon, attacking the Shah and American influence. There were protests in response to his arrest, protests that were violently suppressed. He was eventually released and then exiled, first to Turkey, then to Iraq, then to Paris. But exile did not silence him. It gave him distance and, in some ways, a clearer platform. From Paris, he recorded political sermons on cassette tapes that were smuggled into Iran by the thousands. People would gather in mosques and private homes to listen to them. The infrastructure of opposition was being built quietly across a decade, while Washington was focused entirely on the Shah's military capabilities and oil production figures.
And the oil wealth itself created its own contradictions, didn't it? Because the 1973 oil shock produced a massive surge in Iranian revenues. But that money did not flow evenly.
Not even close. The 1973 oil price shock made Iran extraordinarily wealthy, almost overnight. The Shah launched an ambitious modernization drive. Nuclear plants, highways, industrial projects, military procurement on a staggering scale. But the wealth was concentrated. The gap between Tehran's affluent northern neighborhoods and the rest of the country, particularly the rural poor and the urban working class, was vast and growing. Inflation was rising, housing was expensive, and many Iranians who had migrated to the cities looking for opportunity found themselves economically excluded from the prosperity they could see but not access.
Which creates a classic revolutionary condition: rapid modernization, producing not satisfaction, but rising expectations that the system cannot meet.
Exactly, and Washington missed it almost entirely. As late as November 1977, President Carter visited Tehran and offered that famous toast to the Shah's Iran as an island of stability. The CIA's formal assessments in that period did not predict revolutionary instability. The intelligence failure was not simply a matter of bad data, it was a failure of imagination. When your entire analytical framework is built around Cold War bipolarity, and your primary source of information about a country is the government you are allied with, you are not going to see what is building in the streets, in the mosques, and in the cassette tapes being passed from hand to hand.
A government that Washington helped build, helped arm, and helped protect, and yet had almost no genuine understanding of. That is a remarkable and sobering observation with which to close this chapter of the story. Sara, we have spent the last several sections building toward this moment. We have the Shah, backed by Washington, protected by Savak, sitting on enormous oil wealth. And underneath the surface, a country with deep grievances, a growing religious opposition, and a population that feels the modernization project has bypassed them. And then, in 1978 and 1979, everything collapses with extraordinary speed. What actually triggered the revolution?
There was no single trigger, and I think that is one of the most important things to understand about it. Revolutions rarely have a single cause. What happened in Iran in 1978 was a cascade. It began in January of that year when a government-controlled newspaper published an article attacking Khomeini, calling him a foreign agent, questioning his religious credentials. The article backfired immediately. Students and religious scholars in the city of Qom took to the streets in protest. Security forces opened fire. Several protesters were killed.
And in Shia tradition, there is a mourning cycle that turns a single incident into a series of escalating events.
That is exactly right. In Shia Islam, the 40th day after a death is a day of mourning and commemoration. So the deaths in Qom triggered mourning demonstrations 40 days later, and those demonstrations produced more deaths, which triggered more 40-day cycles of protest. This rhythm of mourning and marching created a self-sustaining engine of mass mobilization that the Shah's government could not contain without levels of violence that would have made the situation even worse. By the summer of 1978, strikes were spreading across the country. Oil workers walked off the job. That was economically devastating.
And then there was the cinema fire in Abadan. That became a pivotal moment.
In August 1978, a fire broke out at the Cinema Rex in the city of Abadan. Over 400 people were killed, trapped inside a burning building. The government blamed Islamic radicals. The opposition blamed Savak. The truth of who was responsible has never been fully established. But in that political atmosphere, the population believed the government's version of almost nothing. The fire became a symbol of the Shah's brutality, real or attributed, and added enormous emotional fuel to a movement that was already burning.
By the end of 1978, the Shah's position was essentially untenable. How quickly did the final collapse come?
It came with a speed that genuinely shocked observers who had been watching closely. In January 1979, the Shah left Iran, officially for medical treatment, but everyone understood he was not coming back. He was a man in poor health, politically abandoned, and facing a country that no longer recognized his authority. On February 1, 1979, Ayatollah Khomeini's Air France flight landed in Tehran. Over 5 million people are estimated to have lined the streets of the capital to witness his return from 15 years of exile. It was one of the most dramatic political homecomings in modern history. The symbolism was total. The man the Shah had expelled was returning as the undisputed moral authority of the nation.
And the military, which the Shah had spent enormous sums building into one of the most powerful forces in the region, simply did not resist.
Soldiers were defecting rather than firing on protesters. The institution that was supposed to be the last line of the Shah's defense had been hollowed out by decades of political loyalty tests, corruption, and the simple human reality that you cannot ask an army to kill its own people indefinitely. Within days of Khomeini's return, the Shah's government formally collapsed. The Islamic Republic of Iran was declared on April 1, 1979, following a national referendum. The margin was overwhelming, though the ballot offered only one option.
Now, the revolution in its early weeks was not purely Islamist. There was a broad coalition involved: liberals, leftists, feminists, secular nationalists. What happened to that coalition?
This is the part of the story that carries the most tragedy, in my view. The revolution that toppled the Shah was genuinely diverse in its composition. Leftists, liberals, women's rights advocates, secular intellectuals. They all participated, united by their opposition to the Shah and to American influence. Many of them believed that Khomeini would serve as a transitional moral figure, that once the Shah was gone, Iran would move towards something resembling a democratic republic, with the clergy stepping back from direct governance. That belief was, in retrospect, a catastrophic misreading of Khomeini's intentions.
And Khomeini's governing theory, velayat-e-faqih, was something genuinely new, wasn't it? It did not have a deep precedent, even within Shia Islamic tradition.
It was a significant innovation, and a controversial one even among senior Shia clerics. Velayat-e-faqih translates roughly as the guardianship of the Islamic jurist. Khomeini's argument was that in the absence of the hidden imam, a messianic figure central to Shia theology, political authority should rest with the most qualified Islamic scholar, not with an elected parliament, not with a president, but with a supreme leader whose religious authority superseded all other political institutions. This was the constitutional foundation of the Islamic Republic, and it meant that no matter what elections were held, no matter what parliament was seated, ultimate power resided in one man, and that man was not democratically accountable.
And the coalition that had made the revolution possible. What happened to them once this structure was in place?
They were systematically eliminated. Within 2 years of the revolution, the secular left had been suppressed. The Marxist Mojahedin Khalq, a group that had fought alongside the Islamists against the Shah, was declared an enemy organization, and its members were arrested, tortured, and executed in large numbers. Liberal nationalists who had served in the first post-revolutionary government found themselves sidelined or imprisoned. Women who had marched against the Shah discovered that the new government required them to wear the hijab and remove them from certain professional positions. The revolution had consumed its own coalition.
And Washington was watching all of this with a combination of alarm and confusion.
Washington lost a critical strategic partner almost overnight, and the replacement was a government whose founding ideology was explicitly, theatrically, fundamentally anti-American. Khomeini's designation of the United States as the Great Satan was not diplomatic rhetoric. It was a theological and political statement about the nature of American power in the world, that it was a corrupting, dominating force that had to be expelled from Muslim societies. That framing made normal diplomacy almost structurally impossible from the very beginning.
A revolution broad enough to bring millions into the streets, and then narrow enough to concentrate power in the hands of one ideological faction. It is a pattern that history has seen before, but rarely with such immediate and lasting consequences for a superpower relationship. Sara, we are now at the moment that, for most Americans of a certain generation, defines everything they think about Iran. The hostage crisis. 52 American diplomats held for 444 days. But before we get into what happened, I want to ask about the trigger, because it is a detail that often gets lost in the American telling of this story. The immediate cause was not ideology. It was a decision by President Carter. What did Carter do, and why did it matter so much?
In October 1979, President Carter allowed the deposed Shah, who had fled Iran during the revolution and was living in exile, to enter the United States for cancer treatment. Carter made this decision on humanitarian grounds and under significant pressure from figures like Henry Kissinger and David Rockefeller, who had long-standing relationships with the Shah. From Washington's perspective, it was a medical decision. From Tehran's perspective, it was something else entirely. It was the United States once again sheltering the man who had oppressed Iran for 26 years. The revolutionary government demanded his extradition. Washington refused.
And that refusal became the justification for what followed.
It became the immediate political context. Yes. On November 4th, 1979, which was also the anniversary of Khomeini's exile, a group of Iranian university students stormed the American embassy in Tehran. They called themselves the Muslim student followers of the Imam's line. They seized the compound, overwhelmed the Marine Guards, and took 66 American diplomatic staff hostage. They called the embassy the den of spies. Their argument was that it was not a legitimate diplomatic mission, but an operational center for American interference in Iranian affairs. The place, in their framing, where the 1953 coup had been organized and directed.
And Khomeini's response to the seizure was not to condemn it.
Khomeini endorsed it, and that endorsement transformed what might have been a temporary student action into a state-sanctioned crisis. Once Khomeini blessed the seizure, no political figure inside Iran could oppose it without appearing to side with America against the revolution. The moderates in the provisional government, people who understood that holding diplomats hostage was a fundamental violation of international law, found themselves completely outmaneuvered. Several resigned. The hardliners consolidated power. The hostage crisis was, among other things, a domestic political instrument used to eliminate the moderate wing of the revolutionary government.
So, for Khomeini, the crisis served multiple purposes simultaneously.
It served at least three purposes very effectively. First, it neutralized the political moderates who might have steered Iran toward a more pragmatic relationship with the outside world. Second, it generated enormous popular energy around the revolutionary government at a moment when it needed consolidation. Third, it put the United States in an extraordinarily difficult position, forced to negotiate with a government that had just violated one of the oldest norms of international diplomacy, the protection of diplomatic personnel. Every day the crisis continued was a day the Islamic Republic demonstrated, to its own population and to the wider Muslim world, that it would not be intimidated by American power.
And the Carter administration's attempts to resolve the crisis failed in ways that compounded the damage. The rescue operation, Operation Eagle Claw, became a symbol of something very painful for Americans.
Operation Eagle Claw in April 1980 was a genuine tragedy, and not only in its outcome. 8 American Special Operations soldiers died when 2 aircraft collided in the Iranian desert. The mission had to be aborted before it even reached Tehran. The images of burning American aircraft in the desert, broadcast around the world, were devastating for American prestige. For the Carter administration, it was a political catastrophe from which it never recovered. For Iran's revolutionary government, it was confirmation that American military power had limits, that defiance was not only ideologically justified, but practically viable.
444 days. Let's sit with that number for a moment. What was the human experience of the hostages themselves during that period?
It was psychologically brutal. The hostages were subjected to extended isolation, sleep deprivation, mock executions, and constant uncertainty about whether they would ever be released or whether their situation would escalate into something worse. They were moved between locations, prevented from communicating freely with their families, and used as props in political theater, paraded before cameras, forced to wear blindfolds for public appearances. Several suffered lasting psychological damage. The fact that all 52 survivors returned home alive was, in some ways, almost accidental. The situation had enough volatile elements that it could easily have ended in direct military confrontation, or worse.
And then, the release itself. The timing has always been one of the most debated questions in American political history.
The hostages were released on January 20th, 1981, the precise moment Ronald Reagan was being sworn in as President of the United States. The negotiations had been conducted through Algerian intermediaries, and the terms included the unfreezing of Iranian assets held in American banks. Whether the Reagan campaign had made secret arrangements with Iran to delay the release until after the election, what became known as the October surprise theory, has never been definitively proven or disproven. What is not disputed is the timing itself, and the fact that Carter's failure to free the hostages before Election Day contributed significantly to his defeat.
And the structural consequence that outlasted all of the politics. The breaking of diplomatic relations.
In April 1980, the United States formally severed diplomatic relations with Iran. Those relations have never been restored. For more than 4 decades, the two countries have had no embassies in each other's capitals. Every diplomatic interaction, and there have been some, including the nuclear negotiations, has required third-party intermediaries. Switzerland formally represents American interests in Tehran. That absence of direct diplomatic contact is not just a procedural inconvenience. It means that when a crisis erupts, and crises between these two countries erupt regularly, there is no institutional channel, no direct line, no relationship between diplomats who know each other and can pick up the phone. The absence of normal diplomacy makes every confrontation more dangerous than it needs to be.
A crisis that began as a student action was endorsed by a supreme leader. served as a domestic consolidation tool, humiliated a superpower, and ended 44 years of diplomatic relations. The hostage crisis was not one event. It was a turning point that reset the entire terms of the relationship. Sarah, we are now in the 1980s. Diplomatic relations between the U.S. and Iran are severed. The hostage crisis has ended, but left deep wounds on both sides. And then, just 8 months after the hostages come home, something happens that redraws the entire strategic map of the region. Iraq invades Iran, September 1980. Tell us how that war began and why it matters so much to understanding everything that followed.
Saddam Hussein made a calculation that proved catastrophically wrong. He looked at Iran in 1980 and saw a country in revolutionary chaos, its military officer corps purged, its economy disrupted, its international relationships in ruins. He believed a swift military campaign could seize Iran's oil-rich Khuzestan province, establish Iraqi dominance over the Persian Gulf, and eliminate a revolutionary government that was actively encouraging Iraq's Shia majority to rise against Ba'athist rule. What he got instead was one of the longest and deadliest conventional wars of the 20th century. 8 years, somewhere between 500,000 and 1 million people killed, millions more wounded, displaced, or traumatized. The Iran-Iraq war is still not fully processed, even today, in either country.
And the United States chose a side, not publicly and not cleanly, but in ways that Iran has never forgotten.
The Reagan administration made a strategic decision that Iran represented the greater threat to American interests in the Gulf. Iraq, despite being a Soviet-aligned state with a brutal authoritarian government, was seen as the more manageable problem. So Washington tilted toward Baghdad. It provided Iraq with agricultural credits that freed up resources for military procurement. It shared satellite intelligence about Iranian troop positions. It helped Iraq navigate international arms markets. And most devastatingly, it continued providing intelligence to Iraqi commanders, even after it became clear that Iraq was using that intelligence to direct chemical weapons attacks against Iranian soldiers.
Let's be precise about that, because I think it is a detail that many people do not know. The United States was aware that Iraq was using chemical weapons against Iran, and continued the intelligence relationship anyway.
That is what the declassified record shows. A 2013 foreign policy investigation, drawing on declassified CIA documents, established that American officials were fully aware of Iraqi chemical weapons use against Iranian forces and continued providing battlefield intelligence regardless. Mustard gas, nerve agents, used against Iranian soldiers in the trenches. Iran lost thousands of men to chemical weapons attacks. Veterans of that war, men now in their 60s and 70s, are still dying from the long-term effects of chemical exposure. When Iranian officials today express deep suspicion about Western commitments to international norms, this history is never far from the surface of that suspicion.
And then, the U.S. Navy became directly involved in the conflict, not as a declared combatant, but in ways that brought American and Iranian forces into direct confrontation.
Operation Earnest Will, beginning in 1987, involved the U.S. Navy escorting Kuwaiti oil tankers through the Persian Gulf under American flags, protecting them from Iranian attacks targeting Gulf state shipping that was effectively supporting Iraq. Iranian and American naval forces exchanged fire on multiple occasions. In April 1988, the U.S. Navy destroyed 2 Iranian oil platforms and sank or damaged several Iranian naval vessels in a single day of fighting. Operation Praying Mantis. It was the largest American naval surface engagement since World War II. And then, 3 months later, came the incident that has never been resolved emotionally between the two countries.
Iran Air Flight 655.
On July 3, 1988, the USS Vincennes, an American guided missile cruiser operating in the Persian Gulf, shot down Iran Air Flight 655, a commercial Airbus on a scheduled civilian route from Tehran to Dubai. All 290 people on board were killed, including 66 children. The U.S. military maintained it was a tragic case of mistaken identification, that the crew believed they were targeting and attacking Iranian military aircraft. Iran called it deliberate murder. The United States never formally apologized. It paid compensation to the families without admitting legal liability. The Iranian government erected a monument to the victims. That incident sits in Iranian national memory alongside 1953 and the hostage crisis as evidence of American willingness to kill Iranian civilians without accountability.
And then there is the Iran-Contra affair, which revealed something remarkable about the gap between official American policy and what was actually happening behind closed doors.
Iran-Contra is one of the most revealing episodes in American foreign policy history, precisely because of its contradiction. The Reagan administration was publicly positioning Iran as a terrorist state, supporting Iraq in a war against Iran, and refusing all official contact with Tehran. Simultaneously, it was secretly selling weapons to Iran, anti-tank missiles and spare parts for military equipment, through Israeli intermediaries. The proceeds from those weapons sales were then illegally funneled to Contra rebels in Nicaragua, in violation of congressional prohibition. When this became public in 1986, it did not simply damage Ronald Reagan's presidency. It confirmed for Iran's government something it had long believed, that American public commitments could not be trusted, that Washington operated according to hidden agendas, and that any future engagement with the United States would need to account for the gap between what America said and what America did.
And out of all of this, the chemical weapons, the naval confrontations, the covert arms deals, Iran drew a set of strategic conclusions that have shaped its behavior ever since.
The conclusions were stark, and from Iran's perspective, entirely rational. The first was that the international community would not protect Iran from aggression, not from chemical weapons, not from conventional military attack, not from economic warfare. The second was that conventional military power alone could not deter a superpower. The third, and this is the one with the longest consequences, was that Iran needed to develop its own deterrent capability, its own network of influence, and its own strategic depth that could not be eliminated by sanctions or military pressure alone. The proxy strategy, the nuclear program, the investment in asymmetric capabilities, all of it traces back to the lessons Iran drew from the 1980s.
A decade that began with a war Iran did not start, continued with chemical weapons it absorbed without international protection, and ended with a covert American arms deal that violated every public commitment Washington had made. The 1980s did not create the U.S.-Iran rivalry, but they calcified it in ways that made resolution significantly harder. Sara, everything we have discussed so far, 1953, the revolution, the hostage crisis, the Iran-Iraq war, has been building toward the issue that sits at the absolute center of the U.S.-Iran rivalry today: the nuclear program. It is the issue that has driven sanctions, military threats, diplomatic negotiations, and some of the most dangerous moments of brinkmanship in the post-Cold War era. But before we get to the crisis it has produced, I want to start with something that surprises most people when they first hear it. The United States did not discover Iran's nuclear program and sound the alarm. The United States actually helped create it. Sara, can you take us back to that origin?
This is one of those historical ironies that is almost too stark to believe until you look at the documents. In 1957, the United States and Iran signed a civilian nuclear cooperation agreement under President Eisenhower's Atoms for Peace initiative, a program designed to share nuclear technology with allied nations for peaceful energy purposes. The U.S. helped Iran establish a nuclear research center at Tehran University. American companies trained Iranian scientists. Washington actively encouraged the Shah to develop nuclear energy infrastructure. At one point, the U.S. and Iran were even discussing the construction of multiple nuclear power plants across Iranian territory. The country that would spend decades demanding Iran abandon its nuclear program was the country that gave Iran its first nuclear capabilities.
And after the revolution, the program was initially suspended, but then quietly revived.
Khomeini's government initially halted the nuclear program. There was a theological dimension to this. Some clerics argued that weapons of mass destruction were incompatible with Islamic principles. But the Iran-Iraq war changed that calculus entirely, when Iran absorbed chemical weapons attacks without any meaningful international response. When it watched the world effectively look away while its soldiers died in the trenches, the conclusion drawn by Iranian military planners was unambiguous. A country without a credible deterrent was a country that could be attacked with impunity. The nuclear program was quietly revived in the late 1980s, with assistance from Pakistan's AQ-Khan network and other sources. It was built in secret, and it stayed secret for over a decade.
Until 2002, when everything changed.
In August 2002, an Iranian opposition group, the Mojahedin-e-Khalq, operating from exile, held a press conference in Washington and publicly revealed the existence of two undisclosed nuclear facilities: a uranium enrichment plant at Natanz, buried underground, a heavy water production facility at Iraq. The international community was suddenly confronted with evidence of a program that had been hidden for years, in direct violation of Iran's obligations to declare nuclear activities under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. The revelation launched what has now been more than 2 decades of crisis diplomacy: negotiations, sanctions, inspections, threats, and partial agreements that have never fully resolved the fundamental question of what Iran is actually building.
Let's make sure our viewers understand the technical core of this dispute, because I think the enrichment question is where a lot of people get lost. Can you explain the difference between enrichment for energy and enrichment for a weapon?
The key is the concept of concentration. Natural uranium contains a very small percentage of the isotope U-235, which is the fissile component, the part that sustains a nuclear chain reaction. To use uranium as reactor fuel for civilian energy production, you need to enrich it to roughly 3 to 5% U-235. To produce a nuclear weapon, you need to enrich it to approximately 90%. The same basic technology, centrifuges spinning at enormous speeds, is used for both purposes. The difference is how long you run the process and to what level of concentration you take it. Iran has consistently argued it is enriching only for civilian energy purposes. The concern from the US, Israel, and European powers has been that the infrastructure itself is the threat, because a country with thousands of advanced centrifuges enriching to 5% has most of what it needs to enrich to 90% if it chooses to.
And that gap between capability and intent is exactly where the diplomatic crisis lives.
That is precisely where it lives. The international community cannot easily verify intent. It can only verify capability. And Iran's capability has grown significantly over the past 2 decades, regardless of the diplomatic agreements in place at any given time. By 2023, Iran had enriched uranium to 84% purity, just one technical step below weapons grade. That number represents a dramatic escalation from where things stood even 5 years earlier. The trajectory of the program, measured in centrifuges installed and enrichment levels reached, has been consistently upward.
Israel has been particularly vocal and particularly direct about where it draws its red line on this issue.
Israel has stated through multiple administrations and multiple prime ministers that a nuclear-armed Iran represents an existential threat. Benjamin Netanyahu has made this argument on the floor of the United Nations General Assembly with visual props, including the now famous cartoon bomb diagram, to illustrate how close Iran was getting to a weapons capability. Israel is believed to possess its own undeclared nuclear arsenal, something it neither confirms nor denies. And the prospect of a nuclear Iran in its neighborhood is something Israeli security planners view as categorically unacceptable. This creates a triangular dynamic that complicates every US-Iran negotiation. Washington cannot simply negotiate bilaterally with Tehran without accounting for the possibility that Israel might take unilateral military action if it believes a red line has been crossed.
And the sanctions architecture that was built around this issue, this was not simply a diplomatic signal. It was a serious attempt to make Iran's nuclear program economically unbearable to continue.
The sanctions regime that developed from the mid-2000s onward was among the most comprehensive ever imposed on any country. It targeted Iran's oil exports, its access to the international banking system through the SWIFT network, its ability to import technology and industrial components, and the ability of Iranian businesses to engage in normal international commerce. By the early 2010s, Iran's currency, the rial, had lost a staggering percentage of its value. Inflation was running at rates that devastated ordinary household budgets. Oil exports, which are the lifeblood of the Iranian state's revenue, were cut by more than half. The economic pain was real, measurable, and fell disproportionately on ordinary Iranians, rather than on the political and military leadership that controlled the nuclear program.
And Iran's consistent response to that pressure was to argue that it had the legal right to enrich uranium, that the NPT actually protected this activity.
Iran's legal argument has always been Article 4 of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which affirms the right of all signatory states to develop nuclear energy for peaceful purposes. Iran signed the NPT. It argues that enrichment for civilian energy is explicitly protected by the treaty it signed. The counter-argument from Western powers has been that Iran's pattern of concealment, building facilities in secret, failing to declare activities to the IAEA, forfeited the good faith protections the treaty assumes. Iran rejects that framing, and it consistently raises what it calls the double standard, that Israel, Pakistan, and India all possess nuclear weapons and have never signed the NPT, yet face no comparable international pressure. That argument does not resolve the non-proliferation concern, but it resonates widely in the developing world and makes it genuinely difficult to build a unified international coalition against Iran's program.
A program that began with American assistance was revived in response to a war fought with chemical weapons and has since become the single most dangerous technical dimension of a rivalry that was already deeply entrenched before the first centrifuge ever started spinning. Sara, we have spent the last several sections tracing the accumulation of grievances, miscalculations, and structural mistrust that define this rivalry. And now we arrive at a moment that stands somewhat apart from everything else in this story. A moment when the two sides actually managed to reach an agreement. The 2015 nuclear deal, the JCPOA. Before we analyze what it achieved and why it ultimately collapsed, I want to ask you something more fundamental. How did it happen at all? Given everything we have discussed, the broken diplomacy, the proxy conflicts, the decades of mutual suspicion, how did the United States and Iran actually sit down and negotiate a serious agreement?
Several things converged at the same time, and that convergence is important to understand, because it explains both why the deal was possible and why it was fragile. On the Iranian side, the sanctions were working in the sense that they were creating genuine economic crisis. The rial had collapsed, inflation was severe, oil revenues had been cut dramatically. A new Iranian president, Hassan Rouhani, had been elected in 2013 on a platform that included diplomatic engagement with the West. He was not a liberal reformer in the Western sense, but he was a pragmatist who understood that Iran's economy could not sustain indefinite isolation. He had the blessing, however reluctant, of Supreme Leader Khamenei to explore a negotiated solution.
And on the American side, the Obama administration had made a strategic decision that engagement was worth attempting.
President Obama came into office believing that direct engagement with adversaries was not a sign of weakness, but a tool of statecraft. His administration had been conducting back-channel communications with Iran even before the Rouhani election. Secret talks in Oman that laid the groundwork for formal negotiations. When Rouhani came to power and signaled openness, the Obama team moved quickly. The formal negotiating framework brought together the P5 Plawan, the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council plus Germany, and Iran, in a multilateral process designed to give the agreement international legitimacy and spread the political risk across multiple parties.
Let's be precise about what Iran actually agreed to under the JCPOA, because I think the specifics matter for understanding both the achievement and the criticism.
Under the agreement, Iran committed to reducing its stockpile of enriched uranium by 98%. It agreed to reduce its operating centrifuges by approximately 2/3, from roughly 19,000 to just over 6,000. It committed to enriching uranium only to the civilian threshold of 3.67%, not to the higher levels it had been reaching. It agreed to redesign its Arak heavy water reactor so that it could not produce weapons-grade plutonium as a byproduct. And it accepted an inspection regime administered by the International Atomic Energy Agency that went significantly beyond standard monitoring protocols, including access to declared and, under certain conditions, undeclared sites.
And in exchange, Iran received something it had been demanding for years: the lifting of the nuclear-related sanctions.
The economic relief was substantial. Nuclear-related sanctions imposed by the United States, the European Union, and the United Nations were lifted or suspended. Iranian assets that had been frozen in foreign banks, estimates ranged from $50 to over $100 billion, were unlocked. Iran could begin selling oil again at full capacity. Iranian businesses could reconnect with the international banking system. For ordinary Iranians, the immediate expectation was significant economic improvement. The reality proved more complicated because many non-nuclear sanctions remained in place, and because international businesses remained nervous about the legal risk of engaging with Iran while American secondary sanctions still loomed.
The single most important technical achievement of the JCPOA was the extension of what negotiators called the breakout time. Can you explain what that means and why it mattered?
Breakout time is the estimated period it would take Iran to produce enough highly enriched uranium for one nuclear weapon, assuming it made the political decision to pursue one. Before the JCPOA, that estimate was approximately 2 to 3 months. Under the terms of the agreement, with the reduced centrifuge count, the depleted uranium stockpile, and the enhanced inspection regime, that estimate was extended to at least 1 year. That is a significant buffer. It means that if Iran ever decided to move toward a weapon, the international community would have time to detect the activity and respond before the capability was realized. That was the core non-proliferation logic of the agreement.
But the JCPOA had critics, serious critics, who argued it was fundamentally incomplete. What were their strongest objections?
The strongest objections came from two directions. The first was substantive. The deal did not address Iran's ballistic missile program, which was advancing independently and could eventually serve as a delivery system for a nuclear warhead. It did not address Iran's support for proxy groups across the Middle East. And it contained sunset clauses, provisions that would expire after 10 to 15 years, after which Iran could resume enrichment activities without restriction. Critics argued that the Obama administration had paid a very high price, sanctions relief, unfrozen assets, international legitimacy, for a deal that merely delayed rather than permanently resolved the nuclear threat.
And the second direction of criticism was political, about the structure of the agreement itself.
The JCPOA was concluded as an executive agreement, not as a ratified treaty. To pass as a treaty through the U.S. Senate would have required a two-thirds majority, which was politically impossible given the level of Republican opposition. So the Obama administration structured it as a political commitment between governments rather than a legally binding international treaty. This made it achievable. It also made it reversible. Any future president could withdraw from it unilaterally without congressional approval. That structural vulnerability was visible from the day the agreement was signed, and Iran's negotiators were aware of it. They pushed for stronger guarantees. They did not get them.
So the JCPOA was, simultaneously, the most significant diplomatic achievement in the history of U.S.-Iran relations, and an agreement built on a foundation that a single election could destroy.
That tension is exactly right. And I think the word that best captures what the JCPOA actually was, rather than what its supporters hoped it would become, is the phrase confidence-building measure. It did not resolve the rivalry. It did not normalize the relationship. It did not address the full range of Iranian behavior that concerned Washington and its allies. What it did was create a verifiable constraint on the most dangerous dimension of Iranian capability, and open a window through which further diplomacy might eventually pass. Whether that window would stay open depended entirely on political will on both sides. And as we are about to see, that political will did not survive the next American election.
Sara, we have just described the JCPOA as a confidence-building measure built on a fragile political foundation, an executive agreement that any future president could tear up with a phone call. In May 2018, that is exactly what happened. President Donald Trump announced the United States was withdrawing from the nuclear deal and reimposing sanctions on Iran. I want to start with the administration's own argument, because I think it deserves to be taken seriously before we examine what actually followed. What was the case the Trump administration made for walking away?
The administration made several arguments, and some of them had genuine analytical weight. The first was the sunset clause problem. The JCPOA's restrictions on enrichment would begin expiring after 10 years, meaning Iran could eventually resume a full-scale program with international legitimacy intact. The second was the scope problem. the deal said nothing about Iran's ballistic missile program, which was advancing independently. The third was the behavior problem. Quote, sanctions relief had not moderated Iranian regional behavior. Iran was still funding Hezbollah, still supporting Assad in Syria, still backing Houthi forces in Yemen. The argument was that the Obama administration had paid an enormous price for a deal that constrained one dimension of Iranian power while leaving everything else untouched.
And the alternative the Trump administration offered was what became known as maximum pressure. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo laid out 12 specific demands. What were the most significant ones?
Pompeo's 12 demands were remarkable in their scope. Iran was required to permanently and verifiably abandon all uranium enrichment. It was required to provide full transparency on its past nuclear activities, including any weapons-related research. It was required to end its ballistic missile program. It was required to withdraw all forces from Syria. It was required to end support for Hezbollah, Hamas, and the Houthis. It was required to respect the sovereignty of its neighbors. The list went on. Iranian officials looked at these demands and called them a request for total surrender. Even some American analysts who were critical of the JCPOA acknowledged that Pompeo's 12 points were not a negotiating position. They were a maximalist declaration with no realistic pathway to acceptance.
And Iran's response was not to capitulate. It was to accelerate.
Iran's response followed a deliberate escalatory logic. Initially, Tehran waited, giving European signatories of the JCPOA several months to demonstrate that they could protect Iran from the economic consequences of American withdrawal. When it became clear that Europe could not shield Iranian oil exports or banking relationships from U.S. secondary sanctions, Iran began systematically exceeding JCPOA limits. It increased its enriched uranium stockpile beyond permitted levels. It installed advanced centrifuge models that the deal prohibited. It raised its enrichment percentage progressively, first to 5%, then higher. Each step was announced publicly and framed as a proportional response to American non-compliance. The message was deliberate. Pressure will produce counter-pressure, not concession.
And then, in January 2020, the situation escalated to a point that brought the two countries genuinely close to direct military conflict. The killing of Qasem Soleimani.
Qasem Soleimani was the commander of the Quds Force, the elite external operations division of Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. He was the single most powerful military figure in Iran after the supreme leader. For 2 decades, he had been the architect of Iran's regional strategy, building and directing the proxy network across Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen. He was a figure of genuine strategic importance and, within Iran, of near mythological popular standing. On January 3, 2020, an American drone strike at Baghdad International Airport killed him, along with several Iraqi militia commanders. It was the most direct and consequential American military action against Iran since the 1988 naval engagements.
And the Iranian response was swift and direct in a way that previous Iranian responses had not been.
Iran launched over a dozen ballistic missiles at 2 Iraqi military bases, hosting American forces, Al-Assad Air Base and Erbil. It was the most direct Iranian military strike against American assets in decades. The attack caused traumatic brain injuries in over 100 American service members, injuries that the administration initially described as headaches before eventually acknowledging their severity. Iran framed the strike as the first step in its response and warned that further retaliation would come through other means. The world held its breath for several days. Direct military conflict between the United States and Iran, something both sides had avoided for 40 years despite enormous provocation, felt genuinely possible for the first time.
Looking at the maximum pressure campaign as a whole, by most objective measurements, did it achieve its stated objectives?
By the administration's own stated metrics, it did not. The goal was to bring Iran back to the negotiating table on American terms, to produce a broader, stronger deal that addressed missiles, proxies, and sunset clauses. That did not happen. Iran did not return to negotiations on those terms. What maximum pressure produced instead was a significant acceleration of the nuclear program. Enrichment levels that stood at 3.67% under the JCPOA climbed to 60% and eventually reached 84% by 2023. The breakout time that the JCPOA had extended to 1 year shrank back to weeks. The the pressure hurt ordinary Iranians severely. It did not change the strategic calculations of the Revolutionary Guard or the supreme leader.
And there is a deeper paradox here, one that I think goes beyond this particular administration's choices.
The paradox is structural. Maximum pressure assumes that sufficient economic pain will eventually produce political change, either through regime moderation or regime collapse. But revolutionary governments, particularly ones that have built their legitimacy around resistance to foreign pressure, tend to respond to maximum pressure by doubling down rather than backing down. The sanctions became, in Iranian domestic political discourse, further evidence of American hostility toward the Iranian people, not evidence of American resolve toward the Iranian government. That distinction matters enormously. Pressure that strengthens nationalist sentiment in the target country is pressure that is working against its own objectives.
A withdrawal from an agreement that was imperfect but functional. A replacement strategy that produced acceleration rather than constraint. And a military escalation that brought two nuclear-adjacent adversaries closer to direct confrontation than at any point in decades. The maximum pressure era did not resolve the U.S.-Iran rivalry. It compressed it. Sara, we have talked about the nuclear program as the most technically dangerous dimension of this rivalry. But there is another dimension that affects the daily lives of millions of people across the Middle East in ways that are just as consequential, and arguably more.
The answer goes directly back to the 1980s, to everything we discussed about the Iran-Iraq War. Iran emerged from that war with a very clear understanding of its own conventional military limitations. Its air force had been degraded. Its army had absorbed enormous casualties. Its defense budget, even at full capacity, was a fraction of what the United States or Israel could deploy. A direct conventional confrontation with either of those adversaries was not a viable option. So Iran's strategic planners asked a different question. Not how do we defeat our enemies on a traditional battlefield, but how do we impose costs on them, deter them from attacking us, and project influence across the region without ever having to fight a war we cannot win conventionally?
And the answer was to build influence through other people's armies.
Through relationships, funding, training, weapons transfers, and ideology. Iran invested in armed groups that shared either its theological worldview, its political opposition to American and Israeli influence, or both. These groups gave Iran what strategists call strategic depth, the ability to threaten adversaries not from Iranian territory, where retaliation would be direct and devastating, but from Lebanon, Gaza, Iraq, Yemen, and Syria. If Israel strikes Iran, Hezbollah can strike Israel from the north. If the United States attacks Iranian assets, Iraqi militia groups can attack American bases. The proxy network is Iran's deterrence architecture, built precisely because it cannot deter through conventional military means alone.
Let's go through the most significant components of that network. Starting with Hezbollah, because it is both the oldest and in many ways the most capable of these groups.
Hezbollah was created in Lebanon in the early 1980s, with direct Iranian Revolutionary Guard assistance, in the context of the Lebanese Civil War and Israel's 1982 invasion of Lebanon. What began as an armed resistance movement has evolved into something genuinely unprecedented, a non-state organization that simultaneously operates as a political party with seats in Lebanon's parliament, a social services provider running schools and hospitals, and a military force with an estimated arsenal of over 100,000 rockets and missiles pointed at Israel. Hezbollah fought Israel to a standstill in the 2006 war. That outcome elevated Iran's regional prestige significantly and demonstrated that a proxy force, properly equipped and trained, could neutralize the military advantages of a conventionally superior adversary.
And then there is the Palestinian dimension, Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad in Gaza. This is a relationship that surprises some people because Hamas is Sunni, not Shia.
It surprises people who assume Iran's proxy strategy is primarily about sectarian solidarity, about Shia Islam expanding its influence. But Iran's calculus has always been more political than theological. Hamas shares Iran's fundamental opposition to Israel's existence and to American dominance in the region. That shared political objective matters more to Tehran than the Sunni-Shia theological divide. Iran provides Hamas with funding, weapons technology, and military training. the October 7, 2023 attack on Israel, the deadliest day for Jewish people since the Holocaust, and the catastrophic war in Gaza that followed brought Iran's relationship with Hamas back to the center of global attention. Iran publicly celebrated the attack while denying direct operational involvement. That distinction, celebrating an outcome while denying operational responsibility, is characteristic of how Iran manages its proxy relationships.
The Houthis in Yemen are perhaps the most recent and, in some ways, the most geographically consequential addition to this network.
The Houthi movement, formerly called Ansar Allah, has received Iranian weapons, training, and strategic guidance since the early 2010s, when Yemen descended into civil war. Their slogan, "Death to America, Death to Israel, Curse upon the Jews, Victory to Islam," leaves little ambiguity about their ideological alignment. What makes the Houthis strategically significant beyond Yemen itself is their geographic position. They control territory adjacent to the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, one of the world's critical maritime choke points, through which a significant portion of global trade passes on its way between the Indian Ocean and the Red Sea. Beginning in late 2023, in response to the Gaza war, Houthi forces launched drone and missile attacks on commercial shipping in the Red Sea, forcing the United States to conduct sustained military operations against them, a direct cost imposed on Washington from a proxy theater thousands of miles from Iran.
And in Iraq, Iran's influence runs especially deep, because the relationship there is not just with armed groups, but with forces that are formally integrated into the Iraqi state.
This is one of the most complex and underreported dimensions of Iran's regional strategy. The Popular Mobilization Forces, known in Arabic as the Hashd al-Shabi, were created in 2014 to fight the Islamic State, and many of the most powerful factions within them have deep organizational and financial ties to the Iranian Revolutionary Guard. They are formally part of the Iraqi security apparatus. They receive Iraqi government salaries, while simultaneously taking direction from Tehran. This creates an extraordinary situation where Iranian-aligned armed groups operate inside the security structure of a country where American forces are also based. After the Soleimani killing, Iranian-aligned Iraqi militia groups conducted dozens of attacks on American military positions in Iraq and Syria. It is a form of sustained, low-intensity conflict that imposes real costs on the American military presence without ever crossing the threshold of declared war.
Syria was another critical node in this network, and then something significant changed in late 2024.
Syria represented Iran's most expensive and strategically ambitious proxy investment. Iran intervened heavily in the Syrian civil war beginning around 2012, deploying Revolutionary Guard advisors, funding Shia militia forces from across the region, and coordinating closely with Hezbollah and Russia to keep Bashar al-Assad in power. The strategic rationale was the land bridge, a continuous corridor of allied territory running from Iran through Iraq, through Syria to Lebanon, connecting Tehran directly to Hezbollah's arsenal on Israel's northern border. When Assad fell in late 2024, that corridor was severed. Iran lost its most important Arab state ally, and Hezbollah lost a critical logistics route. It was a significant strategic setback, not a fatal one, but a genuine disruption of the architecture Iran had spent over a decade and considerable blood and treasure constructing.
And from Washington's perspective, from Israel's perspective, this network is not a defensive deterrent. It is state-sponsored terrorism operating at regional scale.
That characterization captures a real dimension of what this network does and has done. Hezbollah has killed American Marines, Israeli civilians, and Lebanese politicians. Hamas has killed Israeli civilians in large numbers. Iranian-aligned groups have killed American soldiers. The human cost of this proxy architecture is enormous and should not be minimized. What I would add, not to excuse it, but to explain it, is that from Iran's own strategic perspective, this network is the rational response of a country that has been sanctioned, threatened, and attacked for decades and concluded that conventional means of self-defense were insufficient, understanding that logic does not require endorsing it. But without understanding it, you cannot design a policy that actually changes it.
A network built from the lessons of the 1980s, expanded through the conflicts of the 1990s and 2000s, and now operating across 5 countries simultaneously, imposing costs on American interests, threatening Israel's security, and giving Tehran a form of regional influence that its own conventional military could never provide. Sara, we have now moved through 70 years of history. The coup, the revolution, the hostage crisis, the Iran-Iraq war, the nuclear program, the JCPOA, and the maximum pressure campaign. We are now at the present, and I want to start with the Biden administration, because it came into office in January 2021 with a very clear signal that it wanted to return to diplomacy, revive the nuclear deal, and step back from the brinkmanship of the Trump years. What did that opening look like, and how quickly did the optimism begin to erode?
The Biden administration's opening position was clear and, in some ways, straightforward. The president and his foreign policy team, including Secretary of State Antony Blinken and his Iran envoy Rob Malley, believed the JCPOA was a workable framework and that the U.S. withdrawal had been a strategic error. They signaled early willingness to return to compliance if Iran returned to compliance. Indirect talks began in Vienna in April 2021. Indirect because the two sides still refused to sit in the same room. American and Iranian negotiators communicated through European intermediaries in the same hotel, exchanging proposals floor by floor. It was a cumbersome arrangement that reflected the depth of the diplomatic deficit between the two countries.
And those talks produced moments of genuine progress, but never quite crossed the finish line.
Negotiators came close to a revised agreement on multiple occasions. The technical gaps were, at certain points, relatively narrow. But two political obstacles proved insurmountable. The first was Iran's demand for a guarantee that a future American administration would not abandon the deal again, the same vulnerability that had existed in the original JCPOA. No American president can legally bind a successor, and no guarantee Washington could offer was strong enough to satisfy Tehran's institutional memory of 2018. The second obstacle was Iran's insistence that the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps be removed from the U.S. list of foreign terrorist organizations, a designation that carried significant financial and legal implications. The Biden administration concluded that making that concession was politically impossible at home.
And while the diplomacy stalled, Iran's nuclear program continued to advance. The technical situation was deteriorating even as negotiators were still talking.
This is the cruel arithmetic of the nuclear issue. Every month without a deal is a month in which Iran's program continues to develop. By 2022 and into 2023, Iran had installed thousands of advanced centrifuges that operate significantly faster than the models permitted under the original JCPOA. Its enriched uranium stockpile had grown to levels that dwarfed anything seen before the 2015 agreement. And perhaps most alarmingly, Iran began significantly restricting IAEA inspector access, removing cameras, limiting monitoring, and reducing the transparency that had been one of the central achievements of the original deal. The IAEA reported that it had lost continuity of knowledge about key aspects of Iran's program. That phrase, loss of continuity of knowledge, is diplomatic language for a serious and dangerous development.
And then October 7th, 2023 happened, and the entire regional landscape shifted.
The Hamas attack on Israel on October 7, 2023, and Israel's subsequent military campaign in Gaza reshaped the U.S.-Iran dynamic in ways that are still unfolding. Iran denied direct operational involvement in planning the attack while publicly celebrating its outcome. The broader axis of resistance activated in ways that created simultaneous pressure points across the region. Hezbollah began exchanging fire with Israel across Lebanon's border. Houthi forces launched drone and missile attacks on commercial shipping in the Red Sea and fired missiles toward Israel. Iranian-aligned militia groups in Iraq and Syria intensified attacks on American military positions. The United States found itself managing military confrontations across multiple theaters simultaneously, each one connected to Iranian strategic direction at varying degrees of proximity.
And then came a moment that changed Iran's domestic political picture in a sudden and unexpected way: the death of President Ebrahim Raisi.
In May 2024, President Ebrahim Raisi, one of the most hardline figures in Iran's political establishment and widely considered a potential successor to Supreme Leader Khamenei, was killed when his helicopter crashed in a mountainous region of northwestern Iran in foggy conditions. The succession question that his death accelerated is one of the most consequential and opaque in global politics. Ali Khamenei is in his mid-80s. The question of who leads Iran after him, whether a figure emerges who is more ideologically rigid or more pragmatically flexible, will shape the trajectory of this rivalry for the next generation. The presidential election that followed Raisi's death brought Masoud Pezeshkian to office, a relative moderate by Iranian standards, though operating within the same fundamental constraints imposed by the Supreme Leader's office.
And Assad's fall in Syria, which we touched on in the previous section, represented a genuine strategic setback for Iran's regional architecture.
The fall of Bashar al-Assad in late 2024 was a significant moment. It severed Iran's land corridor to Lebanon, disrupted Hezbollah's supply lines, and removed Iran's most important Arab state ally from the board. Iran's regional influence remains formidable. It is not broken by Assad's departure. But the setback was real. The architecture Iran had spent over a decade and enormous resources constructing in Syria was dismantled faster than almost anyone had predicted. It is a reminder that proxy investments, however substantial, rest on political foundations that can shift.
And then, in January 2025, Donald Trump returned to the White House. What does the landscape look like under that administration?
The early signals from the second Trump administration suggested a return to maximum pressure posture, tightened sanctions enforcement, close alignment with Israel, and a rhetorical posture that left military options explicitly on the table. The administration has also signaled, in some communications, a willingness to negotiate, but on terms that bear a strong resemblance to the 12 demands Pompeo issued in 2018, which Iran rejected then and shows no indication of accepting now. The fundamental tension of the maximum pressure era has returned, a gap between the pressure being applied and any realistic diplomatic pathway that the pressure is designed to create. Where that tension leads is the central unresolved question of the present moment.
A diplomatic effort that came close but never closed. A nuclear program that continued advancing through every negotiating round. A region reshaped by war, assassination, and the fall of a long-standing government. And a rivalry that, as we arrive at the present day, remains as structurally unresolved as at any point in the past 4 decades. Sara, we have spent this entire conversation tracing the history. The coups, the revolutions, the wars, the negotiations, the collapses. And what I want to do now is step back from the chronology and ask the question that sits underneath all of it. Because I think one of the reasons this rivalry has persisted for so long is that both sides have become very good at stating their positions and very poor at honestly acknowledging their actual interests. So let me ask you directly. When you strip away the official statements, the press releases, the diplomatic language, what does the United States genuinely want from Iran?
The absolute non-negotiable for every American administration, Republican or Democrat, hawkish or diplomatic, has been a non-nuclear Iran, not a denuclearized Middle East, not a global disarmament framework, specifically Iran without a nuclear weapon. Every other element of American Iran policy has been negotiable at various points. The nuclear red line has not, and that consistency actually tells you something important. It tells you that the U.S. concern is not primarily ideological. Washington has found ways to manage relationships with authoritarian governments, with governments that violate human rights, with governments that support armed groups. What it cannot accommodate, strategically, is a hostile nuclear armed state controlling the Persian Gulf.
And beyond the nuclear question, what else is Washington genuinely seeking?
2 things that are deeply connected. First, stability in the Gulf. Specifically, the uninterrupted flow of energy through the Strait of Hormuz. This is not simply an American interest. It is a global economic interest that the United States has appointed itself to protect. Second, a significant reduction in Iran's proxy activity, the funding, arming, and direction of groups that attack American forces, American allies, and civilian infrastructure across the region. Those 2 interests together define the practical floor of what any American administration needs from an Iran relationship. Everything above that floor, human rights, democratic governance, cultural exchange, is desirable but not the core.
And there is a 4th interest that no administration will state publicly, but that shapes the conversation underneath the surface.
The preference for a different Iranian government. or at minimum, a fundamentally different Iranian governing ideology. Washington has never been fully comfortable with the Islamic Republic as a permanent feature of the regional landscape. Whether through internal reform, demographic pressure, or something more dramatic, the quiet hope in many corners of American foreign policy has always been that the revolutionary government would eventually exhaust itself. The challenge, and this is critical, is that pressure designed to accelerate that outcome tends to produce the opposite effect. Sanctions and military threats have consistently strengthened the revolutionary government's domestic narrative, rather than weakening its grip on power.
Now, let's turn to the Iranian side. When you apply the same analytical lens, when you strip away the slogans and the revolutionary rhetoric, what does Iran's government genuinely need?
The deepest need, the one that drives almost every other Iranian strategic decision, is a credible security guarantee. Iran's leadership has watched what happened to Iraq, a country that the United States invaded and whose government was destroyed. It watched what happened to Libya, a government that surrendered its weapons of mass destruction program and was subsequently targeted by a Western military intervention that ended in regime collapse. The lesson drawn in Tehran from both of those cases is stark and, from a pure survival logic, entirely rational. Governments that give up their deterrent capabilities do not receive security in return. They become targets.
Which creates a direct collision with the American position. Because what Iran needs for its own security is precisely what the United States considers its most important red line.
That is the structural trap at the heart of this rivalry. Iran needs deterrence. The most credible deterrence available to it, given the gap in conventional military power, is nuclear capability. The United States needs Iran not to have nuclear capability. Neither side is being irrational within its own framework. Both sides are responding logically to the incentives and the historical experiences they carry. The tragedy is that both sets of logic point in the same direction, toward continued confrontation, rather than toward any stable equilibrium.
And beyond the security question, what else does Iran genuinely require from any sustainable arrangement?
Economic normalization, access to global markets, relief from sanctions, the ability to sell oil and conduct normal international commerce. The Iranian economy is not simply damaged by sanctions. It has been structurally deformed by decades of isolation. Reconnecting it to the global system is an essential condition for any government in Tehran to maintain domestic legitimacy over the long term. And alongside the economic dimension is something that is harder to quantify but equally important: recognition. Iran wants to be acknowledged as a major regional power whose interests must be considered in any settlement of Middle Eastern affairs. This is partly about status, but it is also about concrete influence over decisions that directly affect Iran's neighborhood and security environment.
So on one side, a superpower that needs Iran to be non-nuclear, regionally restrained, and ideally governed differently. On the other, a revolutionary state that needs security guarantees, economic normalization, and regional recognition. And the cruel irony is that the tools Iran uses to pursue its interests are precisely the tools that prevent the United States from offering it what it needs.
That is exactly the paradox. Iran's nuclear program and its proxy network are the instruments through which it seeks security and regional recognition. But those same instruments are the primary reason the United States cannot offer the security guarantees and economic normalization that Iran needs. Each side is holding the key that could unlock the other's core concern, and neither side has found a way to make the exchange without feeling that it is surrendering the very things that protect it. That, in one formulation, is the entire U.S.-Iran rivalry.
Sara, we have arrived at the final question, and I want to be honest with our audience about what kind of answer is possible here. We are not going to close this conversation with a solution. There is no solution to offer. What I want to do instead is ask you to think clearly and honestly about whether resolution between these two countries is genuinely possible. Not in the idealistic sense, but in the practical, hard-headed, evidence-grounded sense. Let me start with the case for pessimism, because I think it deserves to be stated plainly before we look for any light. What are the structural obstacles that make this rivalry so resistant to resolution?
The list is formidable. 45 years without formal diplomatic relations, no embassies, no direct channels, no institutional relationships between diplomats who know each other and can manage a crisis before it escalates. A U.S. Congress broadly hostile to any agreement with Iran, where supporting diplomacy with Tehran has become politically costly in ways that supporting diplomacy with almost any other adversary has not. An Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps with deep institutional and financial interest in the continuation of confrontation, an organization whose budget, influence, and domestic power are all in significant ways sustained by the rivalry itself. And then there is the trust deficit, which is not simply a diplomatic challenge, but a historical accumulation. The United States broke a working agreement in 2018 and offered Iran no meaningful remedy. Iran held American diplomats hostage for 444 days and has never formally acknowledged the full cost of that act. Both governments have, at critical moments, chosen domestic political advantage over strategic opportunity. Every time a window has opened, and there have been several, something has closed it. After enough cycles of that pattern, the institutional assumption on both sides becomes that the window will always close. That assumption becomes self-fulfilling.
And yet history does not always confirm its own precedents. You have spent your career studying relationships that seemed permanently broken and then changed. Where do you find the case for cautious optimism?
I find it precisely in the history you just referenced. The United States and China had no diplomatic relations for 22 years after the Communist Revolution, and then Nixon went to Beijing. The United States fought a devastating war in Vietnam that killed over 58,000 Americans. And today, Vietnam is a significant American strategic partner in the Indo-Pacific. These transformations were not considered possible until they happened. The people who predicted them were dismissed as naive. The structural obstacles in both cases were, on paper, as formidable as anything we face today with Iran. History does not guarantee resolution, but it establishes that permanent enmity is rarely as permanent as it appears from inside it.
And within Iran itself, the population is not a monolith. The 2022 uprising following Mahsa Amini's death revealed something significant about the depth of public frustration with the Islamic Republic.
The woman, life, freedom movement that erupted in 2022 was one of the most significant internal challenges the Islamic Republic has faced in its history. Young Iranians, particularly young women, took to the streets across dozens of cities, removed their headscarves publicly, and directly challenged the foundational moral authority of the revolutionary government. The movement was suppressed, at significant cost in lives and imprisonments, but it did not disappear. It went underground. Iran has a young, educated, connected population, median age under 32, that has grown up under sanctions and isolation and largely does not share the founding generation's revolutionary fervor. Whether that demographic reality eventually translates into political change remains the central, domestic question, but it is a real force, and it matters.
The nuclear clock is the dimension of this that creates the most urgency. Because at some point, the diplomatic and military options begin to converge in ways that leave very little room.
The breakout timeline is the number that concentrates minds most acutely. With Iran enriching to 84% and operating thousands of advanced centrifuges, the technical distance between where Iran is and where a weapon begins is measured in weeks, not years. Every month without a diplomatic agreement is a month in which that technical reality hardens. At some point, and serious analysts disagree about exactly when that point arrives, the situation becomes binary. Either a negotiated agreement that verifiably constrains Iran's program, or a military strike that attempts to set it back. Neither option is clean. A strike would not permanently destroy the program. It would drive it deeper underground and accelerate Iranian motivation to complete it. But the alternative of doing nothing while the breakout time approaches zero carries its own profound risks.
So, if you were describing the minimum conditions for genuine progress, not a perfect solution, but a realistic first step toward a less dangerous relationship, what would those conditions look like?
3 things, none of which is currently in place, but none of which is structurally impossible. First, a U.S. administration willing to offer Iran durable economic commitments, not just executive agreements reversible by the next election, but arrangements anchored in congressional action or multilateral frameworks strong enough to survive political change. Second, an Iranian leadership willing to accept verifiable and meaningful constraints on its nuclear program in exchange for genuine economic normalization. Not a tactical pause, but a strategic decision that the cost of nuclear pursuit outweighs the benefit. Third, a broader regional framework that gives Iran a defined and respected role in Middle Eastern affairs, without granting it veto power over its neighbors. Security. None of these conditions is imminent. All of them are conceivable.
I want to close with something you said at the very beginning of our conversation, that this rivalry is not about hatred, that it is about two countries that each feel deeply wronged by the other and have never found a way to move past that. I keep returning to that framing because it contains something important about what this conflict actually is.
What it contains is the recognition that neither side in this rivalry is acting from pure malice. The United States has genuine security interests in the Gulf that are not invented or illegitimate. Iran has genuine historical grievances about sovereignty and interference that are not fabricated or unreasonable. The tragedy is not that two evil governments chose conflict. The tragedy is that two governments, each responding to real experiences and real fears, built a relationship so saturated with mistrust that rational communication became almost structurally impossible. And that structure has now persisted long enough to feel permanent, even though it is not.
And for our audience, wherever you are watching or listening from, I think that is the most important analytical takeaway from everything we have discussed today. The most dangerous and durable conflicts in the world are rarely between people with no reasons for their positions. They are between people with real grievances on both sides, operating within institutional frameworks that reward confrontation and punish compromise, unable to find the combination of political will and strategic creativity that resolution requires.
And I would add, for those watching who are using this episode to strengthen their English and their understanding of the world, that the ability to hold two things simultaneously is one of the most valuable intellectual skills you can develop. The United States has done real harm to Iran. Iran has done real harm to American interests and to people across the region. Both of those statements are true. Neither cancels the other. The capacity to resist simplification, to refuse the version of events that makes one side entirely right and the other entirely wrong, is not weakness. It is the beginning of genuine understanding.
Dr. Sara Kashani, this has been one of the most illuminating, carefully reasoned, and genuinely important conversations we have had on this channel. Thank you for the honesty, the nuance, and the depth you brought to every part of it.
Thank you, Daniel. These conversations matter, not because they solve anything, but because understanding is always the necessary condition for any solution that eventually arrives.
For everyone watching and listening, from Washington to Tehran, from London to Lagos, from wherever in the world you found the policy room today, this is what serious geopolitical analysis looks like when it is done without an agenda. The U.S.-Iran rivalry is not over. It is not resolved. But it is, after today, perhaps a little less mysterious. We will see you next time.